why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times, and more. Let's be honest, while the idea of medieval times may seem enchanting with its castles, gallant knights, and tales of chivalry, the real story is far grimmer. The Middle Ages, which spanned roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, were a time of hardship, disease, superstition, and brutality. If you were suddenly transported back to a random day in the Middle Ages, you'd likely be counting the seconds until you could escape back to the comforts of the 21st century. In this article, we'll explore in depth why you probably wouldn't last a single day in medieval times, and much more. 1. Hygiene was non-existent by modern standards. We live in an age of hot showers, scented soaps, hand sanitizers, and clean drinking water. In the Middle Ages? Not so much. For starters, regular bathing was rare. Some communities and cultures did value cleanliness more than others, but for most people, particularly peasants, washing meant a quick rinse in a dirty river or a basin with reused water. Soap was a luxury, and shampoo didn't exist. People's clothes were rarely washed, and even nobility wore perfumed layers rather than clean outfits. Streets in towns and cities often functioned as open sewers. People dumped human waste out of their windows into the street. The result was not only an unbearable stench but a breeding ground for diseases. Imagine walking through a crowded, noisy market square, surrounded by rotting food, dung, animal carcasses, and an omnipresent cloud of foul odor. Even dental hygiene was nearly non-existent. Toothpaste hadn't been invented, and while people did sometimes use twigs or cloth to clean their teeth, dental decay was rampant. Toothaches were common, and extractions were usually done by barbers using horrifying tools. 2. Rampant disease and medical ignorance. Medical knowledge in medieval Europe was severely limited. The dominant theory was the humoral system, developed by ancient Greek physicians like Galen. Illnesses were believed to be caused by an imbalance in bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and treatments ranged from bloodletting and leeches to the use of herbs and prayers. Common injuries and infections that are easily treatable today could turn deadly in medieval times. A simple cut might become infected and lead to sepsis. There were no antibiotics. The most notorious disease of all, the Black Death, killed tens of millions across Europe between 1347 and 1351. Carried by fleas and rats, the plague spread rapidly in densely packed, unsanitary cities. Hospitals existed, but they weren't places for healing in the modern sense. They were mostly run by religious institutions, and patients were often subjected to dubious procedures or just left to die in peace. Surgical instruments were crude and unsterilized, and anesthesia was limited to alcohol or herbal concoctions that were more numbing than truly pain-relieving. 3. A miserable diet and constant hunger. Forget your morning latte and protein bar. The medieval diet for most people consisted largely of bread, porridge, legumes, and occasionally vegetables or dairy if available. Peasants relied on a monotonous diet centered around grains. Meat was rare, expensive, and usually reserved for the wealthy. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal and often unavailable. Preservation methods were primitive. Salting and smoking were common, but spoilage was still a major issue. Meals were often cold, hard, and flavorless. Spices were valuable imports, and commoners rarely had access to them. Malnutrition was widespread, particularly during harsh winters or poor harvests, which could result in famine. Water sources were often contaminated, so people drank ale or weak beer, including children. Wine was more common in southern Europe but was often mixed with water due to its strength. The concept of a balanced diet or nutritional science simply didn't exist. 4. Violence and lawlessness were everyday concerns. Crime and violence were part of everyday life, and the medieval justice system was anything but fair. Legal practices varied by region and time period, but justice was often brutal. Trials by ordeal were a common way to determine guilt or innocence. Walk across hot coals, retrieve an object from boiling water, or carry a red-hot iron bar. If you healed properly afterward, you were innocent. If not, well, tough luck. Punishments were public and severe. Thieves might have their hands cut off. Accused witches or heretics could be burned at the stake. The death penalty was widespread and could be carried out in horrifyingly creative ways. The spectacle of public execution was seen as both justice and entertainment. Towns often had their own militia or constables, but they were not well trained or well paid, and corruption was common. Banditry was also rampant on country roads, with travelers at constant risk of being robbed or worse. 5. Feudalism, a system built on oppression. At the heart of medieval life was the feudal system, a rigid social structure that kept the vast majority of the population, peasants or serfs, bound to the land they worked on. These people weren't slaves in the strictest sense, but they weren't free either. They owed a portion of their labor, crops, and income to the local lord in exchange for protection and the right to live on the land. This protection often amounted to nothing more than being forced to fight in their lord's wars or pay taxes they could barely afford. Lords lived in fortified manors or castles, while peasants lived in one-room huts with dirt floors and no insulation. Privacy was non-existent. Social mobility was nearly impossible. If you were born poor, you stayed poor. If you were born noble, your life was filled with privilege and luxury, but also the constant threat of political intrigue, assassination, or warfare. 6. Life expectancy and child mortality. Modern humans enjoy lifespans of 70+ years on average. In the Middle Ages, average life expectancy was about 30 to 40 years, and that's skewed because so many children died young. Infant and child mortality rates were astronomically high, with many children dying before the age of 5. If you did survive childhood, you still had to contend with disease, war, and poor nutrition. Women faced additional dangers, childbirth. Without sterile equipment or understanding of infection, many women died giving birth. Those who survived often faced multiple pregnancies with little medical support. 7. Limited access to education and knowledge. Unless you were part of the clergy or nobility, chances are you couldn't read or write. Books were handwritten on parchment and extremely expensive. Schools were few and far between, and education was mostly religious in nature. The church dominated intellectual life, and questioning religious doctrine could lead to charges of heresy, a crime punishable by death. Scientific progress was slow, and much of it was stifled by religious authorities. Superstition ruled daily life, and explanations for natural events often involved divine punishment or witchcraft. 8. Women had few rights. For women, life in the Middle Ages was especially harsh. Marriage was often arranged at a young age. In most regions, women had little legal autonomy. Their primary roles were to bear children, manage the household, and serve their husbands. Education for women was rare, and even noblewomen had limited opportunities outside marriage or entering a convent. Widows could sometimes gain more freedom, especially if they inherited land or wealth. But for the majority of women, life was a cycle of labor, childbirth, and social subjugation. 9. Constant war and political instability. Europe in the Middle Ages was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and fiefdoms, constantly at war. Borders shifted frequently. Armies pillaged towns, displaced populations, and left famine in their wake. Civilians often bore the brunt of these conflicts, either conscripted into service or forced to flee their homes. Castles, while picturesque today, were built for defense. Their thick walls, narrow windows, and moats weren't for show. They were essential because siege warfare was common. Attacks could last months and often ended in starvation, disease, or slaughter. 10. The myth of chivalry and romance. Modern media often romanticizes knights and courtly love, but the reality was much different. Knights were elite warriors, often brutal and self-serving. Chivalry as a code of conduct was more of an ideal than a practice. Raids, pillaging, and even war crimes were committed by those sworn to defend the innocent. As for romance, marriages among the upper classes were strategic and political. Love had little to do with it. Courtly love poetry was popular, but the real-life relationships behind them were often illicit or unrequited. Conclusion: be glad you live now. The past may seem alluring through the lens of fiction and fantasy, but the real Middle Ages were no fairy tale. Disease, violence, oppression, ignorance, and fear were constant companions. While modern life has its flaws, we enjoy comforts and freedoms our ancestors could hardly imagine. So the next time you complain about a long commute, your job, or even a bad Wi-Fi connection, remember, you could be hauling water from a well, dodging a tax collector, or trying to survive the plague. Count your blessings, and maybe enjoy that hot shower just a little bit more.